Okay.
Recording it.
So the program will be on YouTube from this point, and you'll be able to see it and share it. So I'm going to turn this over to Doug Hostetter, who is a member of the Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee and is going to be moderating the program. Doug.
Thank you, John. I'll start by giving a bit of an introduction to the delegation that Joan Baez was a part of in her visit to Hanoi 52 years ago. There's a little-known peace organization that played a significant role in ending the war and enabling Americans to receive the eyewitness account of the Christmas bombings of 1972. That organization, the Committee of Liaison with the Families of Servicemen Detained in North Vietnam, commonly referred to as the Committee of Liaison, was founded in 1969 in cooperation with the Women's Union in Hanoi to exchange letters with American POWs and their families. The Committee of Liaison, co-chaired by Cora Weiss and Dave Dillinger, facilitated those exchanges through delegations of American peace activists who would deliver mail to POWs in Hanoi and return letters to their families in the U.S. The committee had scheduled to travel to Hanoi in December 16 to 23, 1972, to deliver Christmas messages to American POWs and return letters to their families in the U.S. by Christmas. Since I had visited Hanoi 2 years earlier with the National Student Association that negotiated the People's Peace Treaty, Corey asked me to brief the delegation at the Church Center for the UN in New York, where I worked. I claim no credit for their success. They were an amazing delegation. The group included Joan Baez, already famous as a folk singer from her albums and appearances at Newport Folk Festival and Woodstock, Telford Taylor, Columbia University law professor, and retired Brigadier General, who was the lead counsel for the prosecution in the 12 Nuremberg trials that followed World War II. The Reverend Michael Allen, Dean of the Berkeley Divinity School at Yale University, and Barry Romo, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, who a year earlier had joined the demonstration of veterans at the U.S. Capitol, where he threw back the bronze medal he had earned a few years earlier as a second lieutenant in the U.S. Army in the Battle of Tam Kỳ. The delegation was scheduled to leave Hanoi on December 23rd, but had to stay until the bombing ended on December 30th, and the Hanoi airport could reopen. That was 52 years ago this week. Joan Baez is the only member of that delegation who is still with us. Joan has been with us with her music, and here are some video to hear directly from her and others in the delegation, and to see some video directly from Hanoi during that bombing. The video you will see, the destruction of the cities, may remind you of the devastation of the urban areas taking place in Gaza today. You can go with the video, John.
Tragedy.
as a, what is it called in English? A dedication. Dedication, yes. What is a dedication?
To the flag. To the flag and the liberty and justice for which it stands.
On that trip to Hanoi, you went with people who don't perhaps share these opinions about the American flag.
One of them was an outright pacifist. One of them was much more left than I am. We saw things quite differently, and on coming out, we didn't wish to give an impression of disunity, and there was a press conference in Hong Kong that we were immediately asked about, the bombing of the Bach Mai Hospital. We had all four seen the hospital a few hours after the bombing. We all four knew that it had been bombed. There's no question about that. The Pentagon building had denied that the hospital had been hit, or said it was only very slightly hit. We all four knew perfectly well it had been totally destroyed. So we said that.
Can you clarify that, sir?
If the particular hospital is the Bach Mai Hospital, it's blown to smithereens, completely destroyed.
But the next question was, did we think it was done on purpose?
Do you think that this is intentional bombing of civilian areas?
That's a matter that we can't go into now, not me anyhow.
To that question, we would have given different answers, and so I did not answer that question until 2 days later.
I wouldn't know. I just saw what I saw. I'm sorry. Mr. Taylor.
I'd like to say, I just don't think there's any such thing as an accident of bombing.
I think we're all full of a great many impressions that we have not had time to digest fully and put in place, and a lot of these questions require more considered answers after we've had time to reflect.
Is this a Hitler-like crime as the North Vietnamese have been describing?
That's another question of the same kind, I'm afraid. No, I wouldn't want to answer that now.
My answer 2 days later was that I did not think that it had been done on purpose. Later on, I obtained what seemed to me perfectly good substantiation of this. The hospital, which I did not know at the time, was only about a quarter of a mile from a military airport. So it seemed highly probable, if not certain, that the bombing of the hospital was the result of a miss on the airfield. This did not mean that the episode seemed to me, because unintentional, to be an admirable one. To bomb that close to Hanoi and in the vicinity of a hospital which they knew they were there, was altogether too likely to result in hitting the hospital, which it did.
I think I've answered enough questions for this interview. I'm not going to speak anymore.
Your book, Nuremberg and Vietnam.
Were you going to do another video, John, or just go ahead?
Doug, just go ahead and I'll bring it in later after I've got this straightened out, okay?
Okay. The Christmas bombing. After Nixon's re-election in November 1972, and just 2 days after Kissinger broke off the peace negotiations in Paris, American warplanes, Phantom jets, and B-52 strategic bombers carried out 12 days of bombing against the Vietnamese capital city, Hanoi, and the port city of Haiphong. This was the first time in the Vietnam War that B-52s had been used against the North Vietnamese two major cities. Phantom jets are designed to hit specific targets and to carry only a few tons of bombs. But B-52s carry up to 30 tons of bombs and can devastate whole square miles. In the 12 days between December 18th and December 30th, the North Vietnamese news agency estimates 100,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the two cities and the nearby populated areas. In comparison, only 80,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the entire United Kingdom during all of World War II. Or to look at it another way, 100,000 tons of explosives is the equivalent of 6 times the explosive power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. The mass killing of civilians in carpet bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong is comparable only to the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo and the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Doug, let me try to bring in to illustrate that now.
Thank you.
làm quà dân chúa bằng những trận bom B-52 rải thảm, hủy diệt bệnh viện Bạch Mai, cơ sở chữa bệnh và trung tâm nghiên cứu y học lớn nhất miền Bắc nước ta. Nhiều khoa, nhiều phòng thí nghiệm và buồng bệnh nhân đổ sập. Nhiều bác sĩ, y tá, hộ lý, sinh viên thực tập đang cứu chữa bệnh nhân bị bom vùi lấp trong đống bê tông ngổn ngang. Tiếng bom vừa dứt, Thủ tướng Phạm Văn Đồng đã tới thăm bệnh viện, úy lạo và chỉ thị cho anh chị em cán bộ tích cực khắc phục hậu quả, cứu chữa nạn nhân. Thực hiện chỉ thị của Thủ tướng, cán bộ nhân viên bệnh viện nhanh chóng thu hồi và sửa chữa những máy móc phục vụ chữa bệnh cho nhân dân. Mỹ muốn đẩy Hà Nội vào sự hoang vu của thầm lặng. Khâm Thiên, một tội ác của chúng mà nghìn đời không xóa được. Phố Khâm Thiên, một đường phố đông dân nhất của 36 phố phường, nhà cửa san sát và những tên ngõ cổ kính lâu đời. Con đường rộng dài, nhộn nhịp ngày đêm ấy với những hàng cây bàng tán lá xòe ra tươi đẹp. Nixon đã chọn để rải thảm B-52 suốt dọc 6 khối phố lương tâm nước Mỹ, như người Mỹ đã nói, và làm cho thế giới lợm giọng và căm hờn.
Thưa quý vị và các bạn, trong cuộc chiến tranh phá hoại miền
Okay, our first panelist this evening will be Linh Nguyen, who will give stories of her mother's experience during the bombing. Linh is from Ho Chi Minh City, is the Ho Chi Minh City-based program manager of the U.S. Institute of Peace, where she oversees the support of various initiatives, including the War Remnants Museum exhibit project, a documentary on dioxin remediation, a series of dialogues between Vietnamese and American youth, and a regional transnational crime project. Linh holds a master's in public policy from Harvard Kennedy School of Government, where she was a Fulbright and John F. Kennedy Fellow. She has experience working with international organizations, including IOM, UNICEF, Oxfam, and investing in women on a range of development and humanitarian projects. Linh?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Doug. Thank you to John, Doug, Bill, Carolyn, and all the participants here in this online conference today. It's a wonderful honor to be here, and it's also especially meaningful to me. So it's already the 27th here in Vietnam, but it's still the 26th in the US, which was the day of the bombing, as you all know. And it's also my birthday. I was born on the 26th of December, 1987. And it was exactly 15 years from the day that my mother survived the Christmas bombing. So I'm going to show you just a few slides that I have prepared. Perfect. So this picture is my mother. Her name is Phạm Thị Tứ. She was born in 1956, and this photo was taken in early 1973. I think it was in January, actually, so less than a month after she survived the bombing. She was 16 years old when it took place, and it's really right that John was showing you that video clip right before I tell this story, because at the very end of the video clip that John was showing, you can see the street, the very busy street that was bustling with people, and the destruction that was in the aftermath of the bombing, and that is Khâm Thiên Street, where my mother used to live. This photo is her and her best friend, and this is how the street looked like. This photo was taken right, I think, a few days after the bombing happened. So this story my mother has told me many times, and it still moved me. It moves me so much. But my mother back then was living with her family, her parents and 5 siblings on Khâm Thiên Street in a rented house, and there was intelligence about the bombing. So the city sort of knew that a lot of bombing is going to take place in that month. And people actually moved to evacuation zones outside of Hanoi, just in the suburb, in the rural area. And usually it is only my grandmother, my mother's mom, who continues to stay on in Hanoi to take care of the house and also to continue working because she was a road construction worker. But that was on a weekend, and she went to the evacuation area to spend time and hang out with her husband and her other children. And my mother, being the oldest child that was still living with the family, she has older sisters, but who they went to college elsewhere. So she was sent back to take care, like to look after the house while her mother was in the evacuation zone with her father and her other siblings. So that night, on the night of the 26th of December, my mother was home alone. And that was late at night, and she was in bed, ready to go to bed, but she was reading a book. And I will tell you more on that book later, but she was reading a book, and she had a radio in bed with her. It was really cold. She had a blanket on her, and then she started to hear the bombing. And at the beginning, it was very loud. So when the bombs hit far away from you, she told me, you can hear it like it's super loud. But when it actually hits you, you can't really hear it anymore. Like all you hear is like fingers tapping on a window glass, because it's so loud that it numbs the eardrums and makes it impossible to hear it anymore. So she heard at first the piercing sounds of the bomb from afar, and she immediately threw the blanket over on the side and jumped down to the bunker. And she was just a few seconds faster than the next round of bombing that hit right to the area where she was living. And she stayed there. She didn't know how long it was. It felt like forever. She was so scared. She was down there thinking she was gonna die. And when the bomb was hitting, she said that it's so bright that you could see everything. You could see clearly, even if you dropped a needle on the floor, you could see everything. So I think towards the morning, when the bombing was sure to be over, she got out of the bunker, and she saw that the whole house, basically all of the walls that were perpendicular to the direction that the bomb hit, they all collapsed because of the pressure. But the walls that were in parallel to the direction that the bomb hit was still standing, and some of the columns were still standing, even though the whole roof of the house were blown away, and all the furniture and everything was gone, and it was rubble everywhere. And what she saw first was this book that she was reading the night before was blown up all the way up to the highest point of the column, the highest column that was still standing in the house. And this book is very interesting because it's written by a Viet Cong person who stayed in the South and was imprisoned in the South in the years of I think between late 1960s and early to middle 1960s, and then he went to the North and published this book about his experience in the prison in the South. And this title, but what it means, undaunted, unyielding, indomitable. So she thought that was really meaningful. There's a lot of controversies later on about this book, but that's beside the point here. Anyhow, and then so my mother got out of the bunker. She was alone in the rubble, and her first instinct was to try to find someone that she knew. So she went and ran to the neighbors, and at the neighbor's place, she saw just at the entrance of the bunker, a man who was her neighbor was like, he was crouching. It looks like he was about to get into the bunker. And she started talking to him. She started like talking to him and he didn't reply. And then she heard other people inside the bunker whimpering and crying. And they asked her to go to the police station on the other street. So she went to the police station to report on these people that needed help. And on the way, she saw a lot of people, mostly members of the militia, the police, the military, who were digging in the rubble, trying to save the people they could or find bodies. She saw just lots of dead bodies that were lying on the ground. And then after finding the police, she came back. But when she came back, the people that were in the neighbors that were in the bunker were already moved to the hospital to treat for the pressure that they endured. And she saw the man she was talking to before lying on the ground as if he was sleeping. And she really thought that he was like sleeping. So she came to him again and tried to talk to him and tried to wake him up. And she kept just like shaking him until other people around her, they were all strangers, told her that he was dead. And he had been dead all the time. And that moment, she said, it was the first moment and the first time she ever felt so lonely in her life. And she started crying her eyes out. Anyhow, so after that, like she sort of recollected herself and started to went to help people to dig out from the debris. And then eventually her mother came back from the evacuation zone, and together they started to try to salvage from the debris their belongings that were still usable or salvageable. And eventually they came to the bed where she was sleeping on the night before. And a wall collapsed right on top of it, on top of the blanket that she was using. And under the blanket is the radio. And when they were like about to take the blanket out and recover the radio, all of a sudden it started playing this song. And I'm going to play it for you just a few seconds.
You have to click sound before you share.
Oh, I see.
Unshare and click sound and then share it.
All right.
Unshare.
Oh, I see.
Unshare, and then you'll see on the right a box that you click for sound when you're sharing.
Okay. I see.
Right.
All right, here's the sound. Can you hear it now?
Yes.
Vietnam trên đường chúng ta đi, nghe gió thổi đồng xanh quê ta đó.
Okay, I can share this link later. It's gonna be 5 minutes, but anyhow, this is a very popular song and it's like super propagandistic. Its name literally translates to Vietnam on the way we march, and it's a song about basically the beauty of the country that the North Vietnamese soldier sees as they march to war. So again, she thought that was really meaningful. So that was the whole experience with the bombing. And later on, my mom she told me that the smoke and the gunpowder from the bombing made her hair brittle for a whole year after that. And even though she was shampooing, she was washing her hair every day, she said that the smell of the gunpowder stayed on her hair for a year. I mean, I believe that her hair was brittle, but the part about the smell, I thought that is PTSD. But to this day, my mother still believes that she still believes that her hair continued to smell like gunpowder for years after the bombing, and she doesn't even know about, like she's not even aware that is might be an effect of the trauma. But anyway, I really don't want to end on a sad note. Just to show you, I think. Next slide. Here is a picture of my mother that was taken 5 years ago at my graduation ceremony from the Harvard Kennedy School. That was after I gave the class speech on at our commencement celebration, and I mentioned her in the speech. I didn't say anything about the bombing, but just the fact that she is from a very disadvantaged background, suffered so much trauma in her life, never went to college, doesn't speak a word of English. And she was there and to see her daughter graduating from the Harvard Kennedy School in the US. So everyone was like clapping for her, and she was standing up to bow to other people. She was very happy, and this just continues. Like, it shows how, like the connection between Vietnam and the US, and how stories and narratives can evolve and can change from destruction, trauma, suffering to happiness, appreciation, and gratitude. And not only did my mother get to visit the US, this was her first time visiting the US, and she loved it. She never held any grudges against the US for the bombing, for anything. And not only did she visit, she also made friends with a lot of my American friends and forged deep, meaningful connections. She traveled with them to many places. And the picture on top on the right was taken just a few months ago when our American friends visited us, and we traveled together to Taiwan. So that is the end of my story. Thank you for giving me this opportunity to share this story of my mother. She is very excited to know that I'm telling you all her story today, and she sends her best regards and her best wishes for peace in the world, and her love for all of the people who stood by her country during the war and continue to stand by our country today. Thank you.
Thank you, Linh. Our next panelist is Carolyn Eisenberg. She is the professor of history and American foreign policy at Hofstra University. Her book, Fire and Rain, Nixon, Kissinger, and the Wars in Southeast Asia, published by Oxford, was awarded the 2024 Banford Prize in American History. Carolyn is co-founder of Brooklyn for Peace and legislative coordinator for Historians for Peace and Democracy, and is a member of the board of Vietnam Peace Commemoration Committee. Carolyn.
Thank you, Doug and John and the committee for inviting me to participate today. And to all the people who have signed into this webinar. This is the day after Christmas. And it's probably not the most cheerful topic that people could find, but I really appreciate the fact that people did come on this Zoom. And also, I was looking over the list and I realized that there are people here, numbers of people who, in one way or another, are really connected to these events, and that the events are actually very personal and very meaningful. So I think hopefully we'll hear from folks a little bit later. I'm going to start with the fact that older people will remember, which is that in October of 1972, Henry Kissinger had triumphantly announced that peace is at hand. And yet in mid-December, hundreds of B-52 bombers were flying over Hanoi and Haiphong and shattering homes, killing civilians, destroying Bach Mai Hospital. Now, at the time, the White House explained those raids as an effort to bring Hanoi back to the negotiating table and to finalize a peace agreement. But that was a lie. Le Duc Tho, the North Vietnamese negotiator, had returned to Hanoi to iron out some differences with the Politburo. But he made it clear to Kissinger that he was leaving the technical staff in Paris to iron out the details of the accord, and that he fully expected a final peace agreement to be reached when he came back. So one thing that this was not about was about North Vietnam abandoning the peace negotiations. That actually never happened. So then the question is, of course, what explains the Christmas bombing? A short answer to that is that both Nixon and Kissinger were personally frustrated, angry, and furious. They both recognized that the American phase of the war was coming to an end, and they were indulging the temptation to inflict maximum damage on the way out. When you look at the record, and we have this voluminous record of the tapes and the transcripts of the tapes and the transcripts of Kissinger's phone calls, the guy that's always on the phone. When you look at all of that, these emotions of frustration, anxiety, rage, are very plainly in evidence. And the tapes, of course, make that very real. But it's also important to understand why, what generated those emotions. When Henry Kissinger announced in October of 1972 that peace is at hand, he was actually telling the truth. He and the Vietnamese negotiator, Le Duc Tho, had reached a peace agreement, even a plan for him to visit Hanoi for the signing. And as part of their understanding, the two had pledged that neither side would attempt to alter the text. In Kissinger's view, this accord was actually a great achievement, because the North Vietnamese had made a long sought-after concession that they would accept a ceasefire with the South Vietnamese government still intact. And this was very important to Kissinger. He'd been pushing that for months, right? That the ceasefire would come and that the two regime would still be in place. There would be a committee for national reconciliation, which might or might not lead to a new government. But for Kissinger and Nixon, what really mattered to them was that when the troops withdrew, that the two regime would be intact. Unfortunately for them, when President Thieu saw the agreement, he was horrified. If accepted, this would consign his government to oblivion, or that's how he and his colleagues felt. The relevant omission, as far as the South Vietnamese government was concerned, was that the accord that Kissinger had initialed was leaving in place 140,000 North Vietnamese troops in the South. And indeed, even their political arm, the Provisional Revolutionary Government, was already exercising political control in those places. It seemed obvious to Thieu and his colleagues that any ceasefire would be purely temporary, that once the Americans had halted their bombing and taken out all their troops, that the war would resume. And the 140,000 North Vietnamese soldiers that were there and others that would come in over the DMZ and the border would mean that the enemy would really prevail. The quote from Thieu is, "The communists talk about a ceasefire, but they will not observe." But Kissinger was infuriated by this complaint because his point was that if the North Vietnamese troops were in the South, this was because ARVN had failed to drive them out. And as he stressed to Nixon, there are divisions in MR3, that's Military Region 3, that haven't fought during the whole offensive. There are some in MR4 that haven't fought since March 30th. The North Vietnamese had been pushed out by the South. There wouldn't be this problem. But Thieu and his colleagues were not wrong to worry, because during the past year, and even earlier, his military had been strikingly unsuccessful in fighting the North Vietnamese on their own. So the further question is, why were Kissinger and Nixon prepared to accept an accord that was in fact disadvantageous to the South? Thieu wasn't wrong about that. And in the aftermath of Thieu's complaint, Nixon put the agreement on temporary hold because with the presidential election imminent, he didn't want to be having a big fight with Thieu just at that point. However, both he and Kissinger were determined to back it, once the election was behind them. So the question again is, why were they willing to do that? Why were they going to accept that? And an important answer to that question is the American peace movement. For this period of the war, most of the anti-war people that I knew kept feeling ineffective. And I'm going to say a little bit about the people that I knew and myself, but I recognize there's a lot of people out there who might have had very different experiences. But most people I knew felt very ineffectual, felt that we were doing all these things, all kinds of things, traumatic things, nothing was working. But this was wrong. Because from the summer of 1969 on, to counteract the peace movement, the Nixon administration embarked on a pattern of troop withdrawals. When Nixon assumed office, there were 550,000 U.S. soldiers in that country. By the time he was running for president in November of 1972, there were perhaps 30,000 soldiers there, few of them combat troops. Consequently, the ability of the Americans to prosecute the war on the ground had essentially disappeared. But there was another factor as well, which is what was happening in electoral politics and in Congress. For most of us at the time, the massive defeat of George McGovern seemed to prove that electoral politics were ineffectual. In his quest for the nomination, but in his quest for that, I want to put it a different way, in his quest for the nomination by the Democratic Party, George McGovern had actually done something very significant. He had consolidated the Democratic Party behind an anti-war message. By the time of the convention, his adversaries, Humphrey Muskie and many, many other colleagues, had embraced the necessity for U.S. withdrawal. And as for Congress, from 1969 on, various anti-war resolutions were introduced, and almost every time they were defeated. So this seemed like a huge waste of time. I can't count the number of conversations. Oh, they're never going to do it. Why are we doing this? Getting nowhere. I talked to this guy. It doesn't matter. All of those kind of feelings. But it wasn't a waste of time, because it was quite clear to Richard Nixon that to prevent these war deadlines from passing, he had to make a credible effort to remove the troops. And he had a phrase for this situation. He said, "We are one step ahead of the sheriff." And that dynamic never ceased. In November of 1972, after winning in a landslide, one item that got lost, again, I don't know if I had the grumpiest friends in the world or it was very typical. We didn't see anything good that happened that day. But what got lost was that more anti-war politicians had been elected to Congress. And shortly after Election Day, Nixon's allies, Stennis, Goldwater, Gerald Ford, they visit the White House and they tell Nixon that when the new Congress convenes in January, if there was no agreement with Hanoi on ending the war, there would be no willingness on Capitol Hill to keep funding it. I really want to emphasize that. It was very clear the money was going to be cut off, and he was being told that by people who he trusted were accurate. Therefore, when Kissinger negotiated with the North Vietnamese, he had to understand that an agreement was essential. So I want to just turn in conclusion to the last phase of those peace talks that I'm talking about. I mean, there are others, but if we're looking at what happens in December in the lead up, when Kissinger goes back to Paris, he is under clear instructions from the president. He's supposed to effect a settlement. However, to pacify the two governments, he introduced 60 modifications of the October agreement, most of them very minor, and most of which he fully intended to withdraw, but they were going to make this gesture. The problem was, while they were making that gesture, the North Vietnamese felt betrayed. In Hanoi, the Politburo had lost confidence that the Nixon administration really wanted a deal. And reflecting their pressure, Le Duc Tho became increasingly stubborn. So things went back and forth. But as of December 12th, Kissinger thinks they're going to get a deal. It's close. It's happening. But there's a sticking point over the language on the demilitarized zone, on the DMZ. How are you going to talk about it? Are you going to talk about it as something temporary, or are you going to talk about it as a border? And he and Le Duc Tho basically come into conflict on that point. But he thinks we're going to get over this. However, they didn't get over it in the sense that Le Duc Tho was told very specifically, do not concede on this point. And the Politburo was very clear. On this matter of, I mean, there were some other questions as well. I don't want to totally oversimplify this. But on this matter of how are you going to talk about the DMZ, Le Duc Tho surprised Kissinger with the news that he was returning to Hanoi for instructions. But, and I really want to emphasize this, he was leaving the technical experts behind to keep working on the text, and he assured Kissinger that he would be back and an agreement was in sight. I'm making a big deal of that because this lie got perpetrated that somehow they just quit the talks, and so we had to bomb them. And on December 14th, Kissinger goes back to Washington. He's in a rage. What we are seeing now, he tells the president, quote, is their normal negotiating habit. They're shits. They are tawdry, miserable, filthy people. They make the Russians look good. As they had frequently discussed, one option before leaving was to conduct an intensive bombing assault on Hanoi. This would have the advantage of weakening the enemy, possibly reassuring President Thieu, and most important, preventing any other delays in Hanoi before the new Congress came in, because that deadline is weighing very, very heavily on Nixon. Now, all of these are very weak reasons for bombing a place. But Nixon was facing new Watergate perils. He was also in no mood to be thwarted. And as was true throughout the 4 years, the prospect of innocent people dying, or the destruction of their homes, their markets, the medical facilities, none of these things were ever on the table. They never provoked the least consideration on the part of himself or on the part of Henry Kissinger. But it also should be noted that the decision to carry out the Christmas bombings, and officially it was called Linebacker 2, was not supported outside the small circle of Nixon, Kissinger, and Al Haig. Al Haig, I haven't talked about him. He's a particular villain. If people ask about him, I'll say more about him. But all of the other major actors said there is no reason for this attack. The Secretary of Defense, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of the Air Force said, don't do it. We don't want this attack. And the reason was simple, which is since the spring, the North Vietnamese had vastly increased their anti-aircraft capability. The consequence, all of these men warned, was that many American planes would be shot down. And the airmen, U.S. airmen, killed or imprisoned. This made absolutely no sense if the war was ending. However, regardless of their pleas, Nixon, Kissinger, and Haig say, we're going to do it anyway. Indeed, Kissinger is so angry at this point, he wanted to continue bombing after January 1. However, and I think this is also very important, he was under no illusion. The negotiations had been derailed because the South Vietnamese leader, and I'm going to read a direct quote, was, quote, an unmitigated, selfish, psychopathic person, son of a bitch. And since, quote, the bastard can't figure out how he's going to stay in office in a free political contest, he had undermined the American position. So much for the defense of democracy. Despite this awareness, both men were determined that the attack on North Vietnam be ferocious. As Kissinger instructed Admiral Moorer, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, having crossed the Rubicon, the only thing we can do is total brutality. And so thousands of Vietnamese civilians died or were severely wounded as B-52s flew over their city from December 18th through December 29th. And as we know, Henry Kissinger lived to be 100 and continued to advise American presidents on matters of war and peace. Now, as a historian, one of the things, especially in the context of Gaza, one of the things that stays with me is the fact that for all the books on Vietnam, and there are, of course, thousands and thousands of books, there is a very fundamental way in which the United States has never come to terms with the Vietnam War or the damage that we did there or what our bombing raids meant, not just in December of 72, but over many, many years and in many, many places. This is something our society has never reconciled, and it's partly that ignorance and obliviousness that is making it possible right now for us to supply the Israelis with whatever it is they ask in order to kill people in Gaza and, and in the West Bank. As an activist, there are a lot of lessons to be drawn, and I'm sure lots of the audience have their own views. But I think one lesson to me about just reading all these declassified documents for many, many years is that many, many times as activists, you think the situation is lost, that it can't be more dreadful than it is. And yet you actually don't know. And sometimes these efforts that can seem ineffectual turn out to have a more positive result than you imagine. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. Bill Zimmerman was a longtime anti-war activist and organizer. As a leader in the medical aid for Indochina in 1972, he traveled to North Vietnam and visited the Bach Mai Hospital, the country's largest civilian medical facility. When the hospital was destroyed in the Christmas bombing, Bill coordinated the launch of the Bach Mai Hospital Relief Fund, which began as a project of medical aid for Indochina. 2 years later, Bill managed the Tom Hayden campaign for U.S. Senate in California and began a long career as a media consultant, campaign manager for progressive candidates, ballot initiatives, and nonprofit organizations. He is the author of Troublemaker, a memoir from the front lines of the 1960s, Doubleday 2011. Bill?
Thank you, Doug. I want to begin by saying happy birthday to Linh Nguyen. It's my birthday today as well, Linh. So happy birthday to you. I'm going to explain.
You too.
Thank you. I'm going to explain how in the midst of all the military and diplomatic action underway that Carolyn just described, I'm going to describe how the American people came together to launch a fund to rebuild the Bach Mai Hospital, destroyed by American taxpayer dollars, with donated American anti-war dollars. Now, in order to do that, I've got to begin by telling you about the origins of medical aid for Indochina, an organization that came together a year before the Christmas bombing, but over the course of that year, matured to the point where it could do something as ambitious as launching a project to rebuild Bach Mai in Hanoi. The story begins in November 1971. I was living in Boston working for an organization called Science for the People, and specifically managing a project for them called Science for Vietnam, in which we encouraged American scientists to send surplus equipment, old scientific journals, and anything else that might be useful to their colleagues in Vietnam, which we helped to manage. We also were encouraging American scientists to do scientific research that could be of benefit to the people of Vietnam. For example, one of the projects we were encouraging work on was biological research on microbes that might be capable of metabolizing the toxic substances in Agent Orange. Sometime in that period, I began to meet with a bunch of anti-war colleagues, and we were concerned about the movement not being able to recruit effectively all of the new interest in opposing the war that had been provoked the previous June of 71, when the Pentagon Papers were released. Public opinion was showing that the papers and other developments in the country were moving the American people to a more forceful position against the war than they had before. Nonetheless, they were not participating in large numbers in the anti-war movement. And we assumed the reason was that the demonstrations we had been organizing over the years had suggested to more mainstream people that participation included a risk of injury or arrest. And mainstream people were not willing to accept those risks, so they were standing back from the anti-war movement, even though they had become increasingly opposed to the policy themselves. We needed a new tactic. We needed a way of involving more mainstream people in the movement, and we hadn't come up with anything. At this time, November 71, a colleague and I were invited to a conference in Paris of all of the European organizations that were working in support of the Vietnamese. When we got there, we discovered dozens of organizations in Europe that were raising money and using the money to buy medical equipment, pharmaceuticals, and other necessities and sending them to the medical services that were treating the civilians in South and North Vietnam. And they were intentionally not sending money, but using the money they raised to purchase material in their own country and then shipping that material to Vietnam. And they were doing that so they couldn't be accused of the money, of sending money that could ultimately be used for the purchase of weapons that would assist the military rather than civilians. Well, my colleague and I realized that this might be the tactic that we were looking for in the United States, that it was essentially a humanitarian impulse that we were appealing to, but it had a confrontational edge to it. We were Americans raising money from Americans to try to heal people in Vietnam that were being injured by American bombs. And it was to contribute money to that effort. It was a forceful statement against the war, even though it was essentially motivated by a humanitarian impulse. At that meeting in Paris, I approached Cora Weiss, who was, as usual, way ahead of me. Told her about the potential for using this tactic in the U.S. Cora had already formed an organization called Medical Aid for Indochina that was headquartered in Boston. It was composed primarily of physicians, some of whom were quite prestigious. And these physicians were encouraging colleagues to do something similar to what we were doing with the scientists, encouraging doctors to send equipment and old medical journals and so forth to colleagues in North Vietnam. And Cora's Committee of Liaison, which Doug described earlier, was the vehicle being used to move that material back to Vietnam. When an American delegation was going to Vietnam carrying letters, Cora arranged for them to also carry pharmaceuticals, medical equipment, journals, etc. So I went up to Cora and said, look, I would be willing to leave Science for the People and work for Medical Aid for Indochina and try to turn this from a medically directed project to an open recruitment of average Americans to make small donations to buy medical equipment and supplies that would eventually go to treat civilians injured by American weapons in Vietnam. That this could be the basis of a mass organization, not just an organization of physicians. So Cora appreciated the possibility, and we met with the board of directors, and I got hired to do that. At the time, the organization had a desk in a church basement in Newton, just outside of Boston, and one part-time employee. Well, we went to work and tried to lay the basis for a national organization that would appeal to the masses. Sometime in March, I had a meeting with Tom Hayden and Jane Fonda, who at the time were pulling together their own plans to create the Indochina Peace Campaign. And we realized that these two organizations we were trying to build were mutually complementary. When Tom and Jane recruited people into the Indochina Peace Campaign, which was basically an educational and lobbying effort, they needed something concrete for people to do once they learned more about the war, and contributing to medical assistance for Vietnam was one action they could take. We, on the other hand, were recruiting people based on those contributions, but once we got them involved, we wanted them to be educated about Vietnam and to become more involved. So in the months ahead, the two organizations kind of operated as sister organizations and collaborated in the course of the development of each. In April, a month later, Nixon started the massive bombing campaign of the cities of North Vietnam and the mining of the harbor. This was 6 months before the Christmas bombing, but there was very intensive bombing during the last days of May and the last days of April and the first days of May in 72. I was asked to go to Vietnam, meet with officials in the Ministry of Health, and try to coordinate them giving us lists of what they needed that they could not procure on their own, but which we could buy in the United States. What they needed in the way of surgical equipment, other medical equipment, and pharmaceuticals. I was also there during that intensive bombing and worked with 3 other Americans I was with, creating a film that demonstrated the primary target of the bombing was not military installations, but civilian facilities. We filmed innumerable churches, hospitals, apartment buildings, schools that had been utterly destroyed by American bombing, some of it strategic from B-52 bombers, some of it more targeted from fighter planes. But we got a lot of this footage, came back and made a documentary film about it. In the meantime, because Nixon was continuing the bombing in North Vietnam, our organization, Medical Aid for Indochina, was able to rapidly and dramatically expand. The bombing was moving more Americans against the war. They wanted something to do to express their opposition. And by the summer, there were all kinds of grassroots fundraising events underway across the country. There were church gatherings and college film showings and art auctions and door-to-door work, collection cans in stores. And it was the right tactic at the right time. And by the fall, we found ourselves as a new national organization with a headquarters staff in Boston and 9 fully staffed, full-time offices in other cities across the country. Sometime in late November, within a few weeks of Nixon winning the 1972 presidential election. We got a letter from the Department of the Treasury threatening to arrest and criminally prosecute everyone on the staff and on the board of Medical Aid for Indochina, which they claimed they could charge with a violation of the Trading with the Enemy Act. So we had to decide how to respond. And after a lengthy debate, which included all the possible alternatives, we decided on a response of defiance, that the best way we could protect ourselves, since we didn't believe that they could prosecute us effectively for trading with the enemy, when in fact there was no enemy. The United States had never declared war against North Vietnam. We were there only under the auspices of the 1964 Gulf of Tonkin resolution, which did not declare war. So absent an enemy, we didn't think they could effectively prosecute. And in addition, we felt that no jury of 12 people would convict us of a serious felony and send us to jail for sending medical equipment and drugs to help people who had been injured in Vietnam. So instead of accepting their threats and closing down operations, we prepared a press conference, a press release rather, and we told the press exactly which airport, which flight, and at what time our next shipment would be dispatched to Vietnam. And we invited the press to come and watch as Treasury agents arrested us. Well, it was the right decision, because when the night came that flight departed, and it was from Kennedy Airport, on a flight to Hong Kong, not only didn't the Treasury agents appear, but we never heard from them again. Sadly, just a few days later, the Christmas bombing began on December 18th. And on the fourth day of that bombing, the Bach Mai Hospital was destroyed. Telford Taylor, who was one of the 4 Americans who were there, managed to get an op-ed printed in the New York Times on Christmas morning, 3 days later. And that op-ed described the destruction of the hospital. Immediately after its publication, Jerry Friedheim, who was the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs, essentially the Pentagon's chief press officer, had a press conference in which he denied that the Bach Mai Hospital had been destroyed or even hit. Well, Medical Aid for Indochina had sent equipment to the Bach Mai Hospital before it was bombed. I had visited the hospital 6 months before it was bombed. So we felt that we had a role to play in the argument, and we started our own press work and press conferences and releases in which we tried to channel the statements made by Joan Baez and Telford Taylor, who both had been eyewitnesses to the destruction. At the same time, I got a call from a friend named Roger Hickey, who was helping to manage the Public Media Center in San Francisco. And Roger had a client named Phil Gerbode, not a client, a donor, I'm sorry, who had called him and offered to put up the seed money to launch a fund to rebuild the hospital if a vehicle could be found through which to do that. So Roger recommended Medical Aid for Indochina. Later that day, Phil Gerbode, the donor, called me. We arranged to meet the next morning. He flew down, I think, from Maine, where he lived. And I advised him that the best way to launch the fund would be a full-page ad in the New York Times. But we needed $25,000 to buy an ad like that, and Gerbode agreed to put up the money. So the next morning, I flew out to San Francisco and worked with the Public Media Center to create the ad for the New York Times. Meanwhile, the Medical Aid for Indochina press officer, Larry Levin, organized a press conference in Washington featuring former Attorney General Ramsey Clark and Julian Bond, an icon of the civil rights movement, who announced on January 2nd the formation of the Bach Mai Hospital Emergency Relief Fund, and also announced at that press conference that we would be publishing a full-page ad in the New York Times 3 days later on January 5th, because we were trying to provoke maximum interest in that ad. The ad ran on the 5th and provoked an enormous controversy as pundits across the country argued about the propriety of U.S. citizens raising money to assist the so-called enemy and to rebuild a hospital that had been destroyed by the U.S. military. And that controversy, fueled also by our friend Jerry Friedheim at the Pentagon, who continued to deny that any destruction had taken place, that controversy elicited an enormous response in our favor. And within a few days, it felt like we had launched a crusade and were riding a tidal wave. Immediately, Leonard Bernstein announced that he would host a concert at the National Cathedral the night before Nixon was inaugurated on January 20th and contribute all the proceeds to the Bach Mai Fund. Several Broadway plays and a number of off-Broadway theaters announced that on the same night they would contribute their entire gate to the Bach Mai Hospital Fund. Art galleries in New York were staging auctions and offering to contribute their commissions to the fund. Within a week of the ad appearing, we had fundraising events scheduled in 64 cities across the country. Joan Baez introduced me to her sister, Mimi Farina. Mimi wanted to do something about Bach Mai, and she pulled together a meeting for me in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area, with Bill Graham, the nation's preeminent rock promoter, and the leading artists of the Grateful Dead and the Jefferson Airplane. And at that meeting, they all agreed on a massive stadium-style concert that they would put on and give the proceeds to the Bach Mai Fund. Sadly, the concert never happened because when the effort was turned over to their managers and lawyers, they found all kinds of reasons not to have it. But again, back at the Medical Aid for Indochina office, our staff member who coordinated our direct mail fundraising effort, Ken Copeland, launched a massive direct mail appeal to raise money for the funds. And we used all of this to keep the conflict with the Pentagon going as to whether the hospital was actually bombed or not. And it was thanks to them and their intransigence that we were able to, in part thanks to them, we were able to build the fund. And remarkably, there was an Assistant Secretary of Defense arguing as late as February 28th that not only had the hospital not been bombed, but there had been no civilian damage whatsoever during the Christmas bombing of Hanoi and Haiphong. Our campaign, we tallied up the campaign after 6 weeks in mid-February. And we came to the following conclusion. I have some numbers here. After 6 weeks, we had raised $98,500 from newspaper ads, $78,000 from direct mail contributions, $126,500 from events and concerts, and $312,000 in unsolicited gifts. All of that totaled $615,000 in 6 weeks' work. That money would be the equivalent of $4.3 million today. By the end of February, I believe, or early March, no longer sure, Medical Aid for Indochina handed off the Bach Mai Fund to a larger coalition of humanitarian organizations, and that coalition called itself Friendshipment. And finally, there was another delegation that Medical Aid for Indochina sent to Vietnam in late February or March. And I believe it included Alex Knopp and Lillian Shirley, who are both in this webinar tonight. And it was decided when they got to Vietnam, they saw that our project in the United States was not unique, that people all over the world had launched projects to rebuild Bach Mai. And the American delegation on that trip offered to fund the rebuilding of their ear, nose, and throat clinic, which they did, we did. And in the years that followed, many Americans visited and saw that ENT clinic newly functioning. And the story of how the Bach Mai Fund came into existence. Doug?
Thank you very much, Bill. I think we should go directly to take questions. We have only about 10 more minutes here. So if you see a question in the chat that any of you would like to respond to, please pick it up, and or if there are other questions from people that have not posted yet, please add it to the chat and we'll see. I might add a few stories from the Nixon's inauguration that took place, on January the 20th. We had a New York group that was very active, and it was amazing the breadth that we were able to get. We had a New York committee. I remember Joe Papp, Richard Falk, Robert Lifton, Cora Weiss, and myself were trying to figure out what we should be doing in New York. And I remember Joe Papp was on the committee, and he said, he's got two plays, the Championship Season in the Public Theater and The Orphan in the Lincoln Center. And that on Inauguration Day, he would arrange that during the intermission, he would invite peace activists to come up and give a short presentation on the bombing of the Bach Mai Hospital and collect funds to rebuild the hospital. I was a graduate student at the time, and it totally blew my mind away to be there in Lincoln Center, inviting people to give to the rebuilding the Bach Mai Hospital. And I was impressed by how warm and how generous the audience was. I was totally out of my element, but people were very, very generous. And I don't know who it was, but someone in New York organized New York art galleries that on Inauguration Day in 1973, January 20, many of the New York galleries agreed to turn one painting to the wall and to cover it with a black cloth for the victims of the Christmas bombings. And the galleries agreed to donate the gallery commission for any painting that was sold on that day to Medical Aid for Indochina. It was a new level of organizations that I had never experienced before in my own involvement in the anti-war movement.
Doug, Sally Benson is on and has also a story to tell that era. Sally, can you hear us?
Yeah, yes. So early in the Christmas bombing, we went to National Cathedral in Washington, where Leonard Bernstein was conducting either, I don't know, it was one of his masses or whether it was his concert for peace. But when we got there, and I understand that the nave holds nearly 2,000 seats, has nearly 2,000 seats, but it was completely full. And we went with hundreds of other people out into the freezing cold yard, of the fields around the cathedral, and heard the music was piped out into the frosty, blustery winds of that night. And what I remember was so moved by when Dean Sayre stepped down and walked the length of the cathedral silently, no words. And this is after Eugene McCarthy had read one of his Vietnam poems. And everybody followed him out to the front doors and out and down Massachusetts Avenue, silently, all the way to the White House to hold vigil at the Nixon White House. It was a very emotional, moving night.
Thank you, Sally.
There's one question that has emerged in a couple of different ways, which is obviously, if you look at the destruction around Bach Mai and Contem Street, it's hard not to see the analogies in Ukraine and Gaza. The pictures are the same of human destruction for military purposes. Bill, maybe you, anybody could well reflect on the question of how much what you were doing in those years, 71, 72, was built on years and years of work, and maybe help the people who now feel frustrated that it's been so that they're not at that level on Gaza or Ukraine to understand how you get to the point of doing what you did.
John, I think the problems that activists today are encountering working on the issue of Gaza are more serious, more confusing, and more difficult than the issues that we faced during Vietnam. And I think we need to recognize that, because it's facile to call for lessons from the past, but that, they're not always appropriate. We had a strong base to work from. Even though we started in 1964 with next to nothing, doing something that was thought impossible at the time, which is to oppose our own country in a time of war, the outrages committed by the United States and the degree to which they violated the moral and ethical standards of the country were so obvious that a strong movement came together very quickly and had strong public appeal, even though it wasn't majority appeal for a long time. And we had 8 years between then and the Christmas bombing to build coalitions, develop tactics, experiment with all kinds of actions that didn't work, and put those aside in favor of actions that did work. I'm not sure that the lessons that we learned are the appropriate ones to deal with the Palestinian question today. Horrible as it is, and as much as we need to find ways to protect the civilian population in Gaza, the difficulty of doing that, given the intensity of the counterreaction in the United States, is not, I don't want it to be my responsibility to tease out what those issues are, because it's not very easy to do that.
The other thing that we had going for us was the draft.
Yeah.
The draft really meant that at least the male half of the population had skin in the game. And there's a big difference between taking tax dollars and actually risking your life. And when it's your own life that's being risked, there's a lot more moral clarity that comes through when you have to look at those questions. And I think it's one of the reasons why the US government got away from the draft, so that there would not be as much citizen reaction against American wars if there isn't a draft. And then when it's only tax dollars that's being used to destroy other people, it's even another step further away than if it's draft volunteer army. But the similarities of war and the destruction of cities is amazingly similar.
You know, if I could just jump in, I actually especially appreciated Bill's point about the fact that, you know, the situations, you know, in many ways are not comparable, and the level of difficulty on this one is huge. One of the things that, I mean, I'm not sure what the moral of that story is, but I mean, first of all, the level of killing going on. I mean, this is like murder in plain sight. You know, we sometimes think retrospectively, oh, in Vietnam, everybody knew all these terrible things. People didn't really. I mean, when Cy Hirsch broke the story about My Lai, that was like big. That was 1969 when he broke that story, and it was very shocking to people. But the fact that it was shocking partly had to do with the fact that the reporting had been, you know, so minimal. But we're in a situation right now where the killing is right in plain sight, right? I mean, how many children have they killed in the last 6 months? So one problem that we have now is the speed of what the Israelis are doing, right? And just in the West Bank, in Gaza, etc. The other thing that's very striking, you know, because I've actually, you know, in one way or another was involved in congressional work, the situation in Congress is really very, very challenging now. I mean, you know, certainly if I was going to compare it to the work around Iraq, where there was much more fluidity. I mean, here, you know, yes, there are members of the Senate, for example, now that are talking about things like, you know, restoring money to UNRWA, you know, which you would think would be a no-brainer. So you've got some people coming out about that. You have some people coming out and saying, you know, the Biden administration gave them 30 days to show that they were facilitating humanitarian aid, or we would change, and the 30 days came and went. They're not facilitating it. Maybe we should stop. There are now some members of the Senate and the House that are willing to say it, but it's very, very difficult. And I think the level of pushback that we have from AIPAC, you know, and other organizations of that type is really formidable. And it's closing. Many, many members of Congress don't even want to talk about this now, people who had been good on a range of issues, none of which means that we shouldn't do it. Because we don't really have that much choice. I mean, I don't know that we're going to make a great connection to Donald Trump over the next, you know, weeks or months. But I think we do need to do it. But I think we also need to be very realistic about what we're up against now, which is really almost, it's simply horrifying, you know, the extent to which there's non-movement about something that is so basic. And if I could just add one other thing, which is a much longer discussion, so it shouldn't take another webinar, but I think the pressure that's coming on the universities and colleges, you know, I'm a teaching faculty member. I mean, it's everywhere now. The level of pressure is much greater than anything that we experienced during Vietnam. So there's a whole other dimension to the problem.
Let me just respond quickly to two questions. One, as far as visas, any trip to North Vietnam was negotiated in advance. It's a question from John Kim. And so the visa was issued by the government with after a lot of evaluation and clearance. Then Catherine Podogil asked about resistance within the military from Air Force crew. Doug or Bill, do you want to speak to that? Is your memory? I know there were some instances of
I'd
people.
actually, if I could come in for a second, I'd actually like to come in on that point, which
Okay.
is, first of all, I mean, there was a lot of resistance in the Air Force that had been growing, because in these latter phases of the war, it was increasingly obvious that order for more bombing was in fact useless, and that pilots were being killed, their lives put in jeopardy with literally no, viable end. So there was actually a struggle going on with the Air Force that didn't just start in December, it had been going on for at least a year. So that's a whole other topic. There was great discontent by pilots. I was doing my research. I mean, there were these airmen, they called themselves POGs, prisoners on Guam. They didn't want to go. And, people were feigning illness or doing anything they possibly could to just get out of that assignment in December. Where that would have gone, if the peace agreement hadn't been signed, that remains a question. But the level of discontent at that point by everybody involved, the higher ups and the people on the ground, it was very intense.
When I was in Hanoi in May of 72, I interviewed 8 captured American pilots in the so-called Hanoi Hilton. And these 8 had signed a letter to Nixon that was sent a week or two earlier, asking that the bombing of the city be stopped because it endangered them. They were being held prisoner at the so-called Hanoi Hilton, which was inside the Hanoi city limits. But more importantly, they pointed out to Nixon that the bombing was only increasing the determination of the Vietnamese people to oppose the Americans. In other words, it was backfiring. Nixon and Kissinger were pursuing a misguided strategy that killing civilians would turn those the neighbors and friends of the people killed would turn against the government because the government was allowing this to happen. In fact, the opposite was happening, and it was quite well known. I also interviewed a medic who had been part of the ground troops. He was there in 70 and 71. And this is a well-known story about fragging. Frontline first lieutenants and sergeants who were who were ordering their men into combat were opposed by those soldiers, and essentially mutinies were taking place all over South Vietnam on the part of American soldiers. And if those officers didn't respect the desires of the enlisted men not to be put into combat situations, they often had fragmentation grenades rolled under their tents at night and were actually killed as a result of their continuing to insist people had to go on the offensive militarily. And we don't know how many people were killed this way, but my friend who was a medic reported one incident where the officers' club on a base in South Vietnam was attacked with grenades after the officers were all locked inside by enlisted men, and 24 of them were killed in this way. So it's possible that hundreds of officers were impacted by this, but the mutinies were well known. They were taking place all over. They also occurred on U.S. naval ships at sea. There were reports of helicopters and fighter planes being pushed over the side by crew members who were opposed to the missions those aircraft were being sent out on.
And I don't know whether Rusti deals with it in her book, but we've not touched on the fact that one of the reasons the bombing stopped was that a number of B-52s were shot down by the Vietnamese. The Vietnamese characterized the Christmas bombing as the Dien Bien Phu of the air. So there are other many dimensions to this story. Yeah. Rusty, did
Well,
you
I
want
don't, but John, I would just come in. Yes, I do actually deal with it in my book. I mean, I think what you said is accurate, but I don't think with the implication, quite with the implication that you're drawing, because again, what I want to especially emphasize is that at the time of the Christmas bombing, Nixon knew he was going to end the war. That's, I mean, that's what it was clear he had to do that. You know, so I saw somebody in the chat saying, did any senator talk about cutting off the money? Many did. There were many, many resolutions in which increasing numbers of senators said they were going to cut off the money, you know, which was an ongoing issue. But very importantly, I mean, that's part of what's appalling about the Christmas bombing, although you didn't need that, is that this was a bombing that was taking place when an agreement had essentially been reached and in which Nixon and Kissinger knew perfectly well that this agreement was going to be signed. So earlier, perhaps military dissent, you know, influenced policy, but that was set at the time of the Christmas bombing. I mean, it's partly why it was obscene.
But what was the reason they actually stopped? Do you have a sense of that?
What was because number one, their troops were gone. They had no combat troops left as of election day.
No, stop the bombing. What was the reason the bombing ended when it did?
Because they wanted to sign a peace agreement, and because the North Vietnamese had said, you know, if you're going to keep bombing us, we're not going to meet with you. I mean, Le Duc Tho had actually left, as I think I mentioned very quickly, he had left a number of technical experts in Paris to keep negotiating. However, once the United States started bombing Hanoi, those experts were then told to stop those conversations. So the reason that Nixon and Kissinger stopped is they knew they had to have an agreement in January. That had been made very clear to them. Even if Ford and Stennis and Goldwater hadn't said it explicitly, Nixon could count. It was one of his skill sets, right? And there was no choice in the matter. It was over.
Now, do you want to wrap it up? And I'll have a couple of announcements at the end.
No, I think we've pretty well covered everything. You know, it was an incredibly terrible occasion that happened 52 years ago, during the Christmas bombings. But the encouraging thing was, to me, was the way in which such a powerful movement grew on such a broad basis of American people wanting to take a stand against that kind of atrocity and do something positive to rebuild the Bach Mai Hospital from contributions from Americans all across the country.
Thank you. Anybody else on a last comment before we? Okay, housekeeping. Go to the resource and bios page. It was the top of the chat, or it's the link we've sent you before, and I'll send it again. There's an incredible interview with Joan Baez about a month after she came back in Rolling Stone that is worth the 5 minutes to read. Also, there's the link to this record side, LP side that she made that you heard at the beginning. I apologize for the technical problems. It's very obvious we are not a high budget, technically supported operation. We do have costs. If you're in the position to do end of the year donations, they're tax deductible, and we'll send out the link to do that when we send out the link for the YouTube channel link, so you can watch it again or share it with people. We had about 135 people at peak, and we're still holding 106, which, having gone over an hour and a half, is I think encouraging. And we'll get another 100 plus I suspect within the next, once we get it online, we'll be watching it who had registered, and then it'll grow from there, and we depend upon your help in making it grow. So thank you, Doug. Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Rusti, and thank you, Lynn, and your mother. Thank your mother also for helping to bring this home. So our next program is about the political prisoners of the Saigon government, the people that were imprisoned and tortured. And the trip that we're taking in April will actually go to the area of the tiger cages and see where they were held. So we will send out a notice on the schedule for that. And also, as I said, this is like the 23rd or 24th. So if you have a few spare hours in the course of the next couple of months, you might want to take a look at the list and find some other programs that were equally interesting. So thank you and good night and Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, joyful Kwanzaa, and whatever else is in your culture. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thanks to everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.